I'm here tonight to welcome you to the annual M. Moran Weston Lecture. And it's my pleasure to introduce John Coatsworth, our Dean of Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and the university's interim provost. John, as everybody in this room knows, is an internationally acclaimed Latin American scholar. And closer to home, he has reconnected SIPA to some of the most important policy debates in our nation, supporting the work of faculty and students in the important areas of urban and social policy, income inequality, and environmental sustainability. And we at SIPA are lucky to have him leading our school. And I want to thank you, John, for making this important evening happen. I introduce to you John Coatsworth.
Good evening and welcome. The Weston Lecture, as you just heard from Esther Fuchs, is an annual SIPA event that focuses specifically on urban policy. This year, as you all know, or you wouldn't be here, the lecture will be delivered by former New York Times columnist Bob Herbert. The title of his talk is A Call to Civic Engagement. The M. Moran Weston II Endowed Fund for Urban Research and Policy was established in 1998 because of the generosity of many donors. The fund is named for Dr. Weston, who as a minister, banker, developer, and tireless advocate for housing and community development issues, and Columbia's first African-American trustee, helped reshape the communities of Harlem and Morningside Heights and created new opportunities for underprivileged individuals and families. Past lecturers have included U.S. Representative Charles Rangel, Ambassador Felix Rohatyn, and the Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, Joel Klein. This year, for the first time in human history, more than 50% of the Earth's population had moved to cities. We are finally an urban global society. As the world becomes more urban, the development of effective urban policy becomes more critical in creating safe, healthy, and functional communities that provide opportunities for all citizens. Our speaker, for 18 years, was a columnist for the New York Times, chronicling and commenting on the most important issues of our time: war and peace, the quality of our nominally democratic institutions, the astonishing failure to invest in the health and education of our own people, the human costs of inequality, the persistence of racial discrimination and injustice. But shining through Bob's trenchant social criticism was an authentic American idealism, a deep commitment to making the American dream a reality for all. He is the author, in addition to his many columns, essays, and articles, of the New York Times book published in 2005 entitled Promises Betrayed: Waking Up from the American Dream. Bob's career began in 1970 as a reporter, then the Night City editor of the Star Ledger in Newark, New Jersey. He moved on to work for the New York Daily News beginning in 1976. His positions at the Daily News included general assignment reporter, national correspondent, consumer affairs editor, City Hall bureau chief, and city editor. In 1985, he became a columnist and a member of the editorial board. His column continued to appear in the Daily News until February of 1993. In the 90s, Bob started working in TV journalism, a founding panelist of Sunday Edition, a weekly discussion program on WCBS TV. Bob was also the host of Hotline, a weekly hour-long issues program on WNYC TV, both beginning in 1990. From January 91 to May 93, Bob was a national correspondent for NBC and reported regularly on the Today Show and the NBC Nightly News. Bob was born in Brooklyn. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in journalism from the State University of New York, Empire State College, and he's taught journalism at Brooklyn College and the Columbia University School of Journalism. His work has won numerous rewards, including the Meyer Berger Award for coverage of New York City, the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award for distinguished newspaper writing, the David Niam Prize from the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University for excellence in political reporting, and the Ridenhour Courage Prize for, quote, fearless articulation of unpopular truths. So it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to welcome to Columbia and to Columbia School of International and Public Affairs one of the leading journalists of our time, and someone we've had an ambition to bring to SIPA for many years, Bob Herbert. Bob, welcome.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. I must be getting old because those introductions are getting longer. And when I give my lectures, I have to use my cheaters, so the young phenom is no more. I want to very seriously thank John Coatsworth and Esther Fuchs and my good friend Mayor Dinkins and everyone else who had a hand in inviting me to deliver this lecture. It's a great honor, and I really appreciate it. I know it's a cliche to talk about the American dream, but I really have lived it. I was one of the first of the baby boomers, and I loved it. I grew up in the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s in Montclair, New Jersey, which is now a very fashionable town. I watched the Mickey Mouse Club after school and the adventures of Davy Crockett, although I was cool enough even in those days not to wear the Mousquetaire ears or a coonskin cap. My parents owned a couple of upholstery shops, and while we were by no means wealthy, we were fine. I worked as a teenager, and I had a Thunderbird in high school. And like so many in my generation, I experienced those years and the early years of my adulthood as something of a golden period. Jobs were plentiful. More and more young people were going to college, and their education was affordable. Americans, by the tens of millions, were moving into the economic mainstream. America was on a roll in those Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson years. Economic, social, and cultural doors were being flung open one after another, and there was a buoyancy to the American experience that was extraordinary. I am not looking back through rose-colored glasses. I know as well as anyone that the nation was far from perfect. There was plenty of conflict, small-mindedness, and bigotry. Blacks and women had to mobilize to fend off treatment that was hideously unfair. Vietnam would prove an unmitigated disaster. But there was also an openness to new ideas and a willingness to extend a collective hand to those who were struggling. The middle class was growing, and it was not yet a mortal sin for someone running for public office to mention the poor. In those heady, sun-washed days, described by the writer Nelson Lichtenstein as the high noon of American capitalism, everything embodied in the great promise of the United States, freedom, equality, opportunity, and widely shared prosperity, appeared to be coming to fruition. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote of the mid-60s that steadily increasing affluence seemed an enduring and irreversible reality of American life. The Temptations of Motown, one of my favorite groups, who helped power the era's soundtrack, sang of momentary setbacks in love, but felt compelled to add the sociological aside, there's plenty of work and the bosses are paying. That seems a long, long time ago. I've been spending a lot of time recently talking with people who have been battered by joblessness and some of the other fallout from our sour economy. It's for a book I'm writing, and that book is called Wounded Colossus. And I'll be trying to show in the book the extent to which the United States, a country in which I and so many of my contemporaries have had fabulous lives, has lost its way. Despite a recent uptick in optimism, we're still mired in the worst economic environment since the Great Depression. We're still in Afghanistan more than 10 years after the attacks of September 11, 2001. We lost more than 4,000 Americans in the war in Iraq, an insane war started by us in which no one even knows how many scores of thousands of Iraqis were killed. We'll be paying for that war for decades to come, and we've got leaders who are already on the hunt for new wars to fight. We need to get a grip. We've got a two-party political system in which one of the parties has lost its mind. The GOP has given us Mitt, Newt, Rick, Herman, Mr. 999, Kane, and periodic cameos by the likes of Donald Trump and Sarah Palin. How do you satirize a field like that? The plain truth is that we're in even deeper trouble in the United States than many people realize. The poor are sinking into the quicksand of ever-deepening material deprivation and ever-deeper isolation from America's mainstream. They're all but ignored by the politicians and the media. What we used to call the working classes or the lower middle class are exhibiting many of the economic and social problems that we once associated almost exclusively with the inner city. Spend a little time in some of our down-at-the-heel suburbs or Rust Belt communities and rural towns and villages, and you'll see the poverty and joblessness, the broken families, the out-of-wedlock births, the drug and alcohol abuse, the domestic violence, and on and on. You can theorize about this economic and social deterioration as much as you want, but the fundamental problem is the same as it has always been: the absence of work. And that's what I want to talk about this evening, our employment crisis and the need for ordinary citizens to take a more active role in bringing it to an end. Nothing is more important for our urban centers, for the viability and their continued existence as decent places to live and raise a family than employment. Jane Addams said, of all aspects of social misery, none is so heartbreaking as unemployment. This is the story of our time. The American economy no longer produces enough jobs for all those who want and desperately need to work. And it doesn't even come close to creating enough good jobs to sustain what has been held up again and again as the hallmark of American greatness, the nation's proudest achievement since World War II, its vast middle class. And if we can't keep the middle class whole, if we can't maintain a thriving middle class in this country, what does that mean for the 100 million Americans, 1/3 of the entire U.S. population, who are now classified as poor or near poor? Well, all you have to do is look around and you'll see what it means for them. They're being left behind, often in harrowing circumstances. And most of the rest of the country, shamefully in my opinion, is indifferent to their plight. The politicians, for the most part, don't even bother talking about the poor and the near poor. That is, unless they're talking about cutting the meager services that help keep low-income Americans from the jaws of absolute destitution. In press accounts, these smug, pompous, and inevitably well-to-do characters are called deficit hawks. But I think of them more as vultures swooping down swooping down to prey on the poor and the helpless. Let's cut Medicaid, they say. Let's cut the school budgets. Let's fire the teachers and cut classes back to 4 days a week. Let's close the libraries. Above all, let's bring the deficits down. Well, I have a message for the deficit hawks. I don't care how many vital services you cut, cut, cut. You can cut Social Security. You can cut Medicare. You can cut the programs that keep our food safe and our water clean. You can cut until every last proverbial cow comes home. But you cannot bring the deficits under control if Americans are not working and paying taxes. So we're in real trouble here. William Julius Wilson argued back in 1996 that the disappearance of work was the central problem of the inner city ghettos. Well, now it's the central problem of our nation as a whole. 6 million manufacturing jobs, 1/3 of the entire sector, good jobs, disappeared from 2000 to 2010. Another 2 million construction jobs were destroyed when the housing market crashed and burned in the second half of the decade. This is not a problem that began with the so-called Great Recession. We have been stuck for decades in an employment environment that has been squeezing the very life out of the great promise of America. Lawrence Summers, the former Treasury Secretary and presidential advisor, noted in an op-ed piece that in 1965, only 1 in 20 men, ages 25 to 54, was not working. 1 in 20. By the end of the current decade, that is likely to be 1 in 6. Even, said Summers, if a full cyclical recovery is achieved. Despite enormous progress in some areas of American life, most of America's young people today have fewer opportunities than I had when I was young. And it is much harder for someone on the lower rungs of the income ladder to climb his or her way up the ladder to success. The first 10 years of the 21st century achieved the dubious distinction of being the only decade since the Depression in which the nation's median household income actually declined. In the 4 years following the onset of the recession, more than half of the American workforce endured the loss of a job, a cut in pay, or an involuntary reduction to part-time status. More than half. Of those officially classified as unemployed, nearly half have been out of work for 6 months or longer, many for a year or 2 or more. This long-term joblessness, a financial death blow to the typical family, is by far the worst that we have experienced since accurate records have been kept. According to the Census Bureau, about 48 million people between the ages of 18 and 64 did not work even a single week in 2010. 48 million people. That was up by 3 million over the previous year. I told you that the title of my book is Wounded Colossus. Well, the most terrible of all of America's wounds is this chronic, insidious, long-term unemployment. It's a wound that's vast, deep, festering, and tragically resistant to healing, and it's changing the very character of our nation. Of those who are employed, millions are working in low-paying jobs for which they are overqualified by education and experience. College graduates with substantial work histories have taken jobs previously held by high school grads and dropouts. The less well-educated have found themselves pushed into ever more menial work, ever more menial work, or out of the labor force entirely. We should have seen this disaster coming. It has been building for the longest time, and the evidence was everywhere if we'd only been willing to look. During a visit to Chicago in 2003, I learned that more than a quarter of its population between the ages of 20 and 24 were out of school and out of work. Those young people, with nothing very constructive to do, seemed to be part of what I came to view as a haunted generation of disconnected youths, millions of them nationwide, drifting aimlessly from one day to the next, hustling a dollar wherever and however they could, often illegally. It wasn't that they didn't want to work. There was no work for them. That fact was driven home by one of the strangest situations I had ever encountered. One wintry morning, while I was in Chicago, huge, unexplained traffic jams began building on the north side. Baffled drivers struggled for the better part of an hour just to travel a few blocks. Some entrance and exit ramps along Lakeshore Drive had to be closed. Police officers could be seen raising their arms in frustration, unable to explain to drivers what the hell was going on. The traffic crush, it turned out, had resulted from rumors that job applications for a Ford assembly plant would be accepted at a community college. The rumors had swept through several neighborhoods, and people began showing up outside the college before dawn. By 7 a.m., more than 2,000 hopefuls had arrived, and they kept coming all morning. They stood outside the school shivering, tears from the cold running down many of their faces. It was like a scene from the Depression. The rumors, as it turned out, were false. No job applications were being accepted. City officials said an orientation session was being held at the college to identify candidates who might be qualified for relatively low-paying jobs that might materialize in the distant future, in the following year perhaps, at a supplier of parts for Ford. Now that was in 2003, mind you. A few days after that monumental traffic jam, a front-page headline in the New York Times said, "Hiring in nation hits worst slump in nearly 20 years." 2 million jobs had vanished in just the prior 24 months. That was the situation, the wretched employment reality, nearly 5 years before the onset of the Great Recession. As a society, we've been in denial. We've been unwilling to face up to the enormous scale of this employment crisis and the extent of the suffering that it's causing, or to the fact that we have no plans to do anything meaningful about it. Our policymakers keep behaving as if something approaching a normal employment environment is just around the corner, or down the road, or over the next hill. Like a break in the clouds, we'll see a burst of economic growth any day now, and good jobs will be plentiful again. But we haven't been in what we once thought of as a normal employment environment since the 1970s. American families have been able to hang on since then because so many wives and mothers have gone into the workplace, because of staggering amounts of debt. Think credit cards, think mortgages, think student loans, and because of one crazy bubble after another, .com, housing, whatever. Throughout those long decades, ordinary workers have looked on as if helpless, as terrible things have happened to that cornerstone of their economic security, their job. Disaster has befallen tens of millions of American families as a result of globalization, labor-saving technological advances, weakened labor unions, and the steadily increasing recognition by employers that they have workers over a barrel, that workers have basically no leverage at all. Those of us who have done well have no right to avert our eyes, to turn away from such extensive pain, to be indifferent. I had a long conversation on Monday with Peter Edelman, an expert on poverty and a former aide to Robert Kennedy. Edelman quit the Clinton administration back in 1996 after the president signed a Republican-sponsored welfare bill that ended the guarantee of cash assistance to the nation's poorest children. Nearly 50 million Americans are poor today, he said, and an astonishing number, almost 20 million, live in extreme poverty. For a family of 3, that means trying to make it on an annual income of less than $8,500. Those who are just the regular poor, not the extreme poor, earn up to $17,000 for a family of 3, or $22,000 for a family of 4. Those are awful numbers. People can't live a decent life on those kinds of incomes, and it's a disgrace that this is happening in a country as rich as ours. The primary reason there are so many poor people and that their numbers are growing is that there are so few jobs, and especially so few good jobs. Nearly half the jobs in this country pay less than $30,000 a year, many of them much less. Childhood is now the poorest age group in America because so many children have parents who are either not working or who have jobs that pay too little. I was in Georgia a week and a half ago visiting upscale suburban communities about a half-hour's drive north of Atlanta. I wanted to see what was happening in places better able to withstand the ravages of a bad economy than most towns and cities in America. In Roswell, Georgia, for example, nearly 60% of the population over 25 has either a bachelor or a master's degree. That's far higher than the national average. The median family income is $103,000. If you just drive around, you'll see fine houses on carefully landscaped properties. It's a pretty place. But look behind the curtains and the shutters, and you'll see the pain of long-term unemployment. The mayor, a Republican named Jerry Wood, seemed torn between two realities when I talked to him. On the one hand, he was proud that Roswell had fended off disaster. We were sort of a solid, wealthy, mature city, he said. On the other hand, he didn't try to sugarcoat the impact of unemployment. I'm also a lawyer, he said, and I've seen a lot of people in my practice who have gone broke. And the building industry is in a depression. A lot of my contemporaries who had a comfortable middle-class income and good jobs, well, now it takes them months, if not years, to find a stable job. They've got mortgages and kids in college they never anticipated being in that position. These are people with college degrees and careers, successful people who suddenly find themselves unemployed. I've never really seen it happen like that before, the mayor said, on that scale. The unemployment used to be on the fringe. As the mayor talked, I kept thinking, if this is the situation in a community that is doing better, quite a bit better than most others, then we're in real trouble here. I asked if he thought the worst was over. Well, he said, I feel that the worst will be with us for a long time to come. One of the families I visited on that trip lived in East Cobb, which is next to Roswell. Steve Swindell had worked at Pfizer as a sales representative and district manager for about 17 and a half years, earning about $150,000 a year in salary and bonuses. He and his wife Linda had 4 kids, and she was a stay-at-home mom. Both Linda and Steve had college degrees. She'd previously worked for the federal government at the Interior Department and then at the Social Security Administration. Pfizer let Steve go without warning in January 2009. They gave him a severance package and showed him the door. Steve thought it was just a matter of time before he'd find something comparable to his old job. As Linda told me, I wasn't worried in the beginning. He had the severance, and we'd always been frugal. But Steve couldn't find anything but very low-paid work. He took a temp job as a truck driver, delivering packages. He worked at Home Depot. As the months turned into years, he became depressed, but he kept looking for decent work. He now works for a grocery chain, stocking shelves, running the register, doing whatever he's told by bosses who are about half his age. He earns $11.60 an hour. And here's an example of the way the official statistics give the wrong impression. Steve is not unemployed. The fact that he's working helps bring the unemployment rate down. But I don't think anyone would say that what happened to him is a positive development for the American economy. Linda took a job as a lunch lady at a local school, mostly to secure health benefits. It was the best job that she could find. She too earns about $11 an hour. If you think the Swindell story is unusual, you should think again. There are people in just about every age and education category who are flat out desperate for work. When McDonald's announced last spring that it was preparing to fill 50,000 jobs, most of them low-paying and many of them part-time, 1 million people rushed to apply. 1 million people for 50,000 McDonald's jobs. Policymakers talk a lot about jobs, but they don't usually focus. They don't usually get the central importance of a job to individuals and families in our society. For those who are not very wealthy, the job is what sustains people economically. Take it away and the bottom falls out of everything. And of course, jobs contribute so much in our society to the ways in which people see themselves. But the other thing that's so important about work is that consumer spending comprises about 70% of the American economy. So people have to have jobs to keep the economy going. Take away jobs and you take away America's economic growth. People who are out of work don't buy cars. They don't refurnish their homes. They don't go to the mall. They don't take their families on vacation. They put off getting married and having children. Policymakers know all this in a sort of cold, abstract, intellectual way, but they don't feel it. The terrible struggles of jobless Americans are not enough to get them to focus like a laser on jobs. Most will tell you that employment is a lagging indicator, that you get the economy moving first, and the jobs will follow. Here's what I'm telling you. Don't hold your breath. That lagging indicator stuff is just one more variation on the trickle-down theme. Give the corporations more tax breaks, fewer regulations, more free trade agreements, higher executive salaries and bonuses, and someday those great jobs will start blooming again. How many times have we heard that story? The Labor Department's employment report for January caused a lot of hearts to flutter. Some 243,000 jobs were created. But that's not even a baby step towards solving the crisis that has so many millions of Americans out of work, underemployed, working at jobs that pay a pittance, that are temporary, and that offer nothing in the way of benefits. Many of the jobs we're creating are the kinds of jobs that the Swindells have taken. The truth is that employers don't want to hire a lot of workers. Workers are a drag on the bottom line, especially well-paid American workers. The U.S. right now is actually producing more than it did at the start of the recession in December 2007. But as the New York Times pointed out last month, it is doing so with 6 million fewer jobs. And this is where my call to civic engagement comes in. We've got to find a way to push this massive employment crisis to the top of America's policy and media agendas. And the only way that we can do that I can see, is through a real citizens movement. We have many, many serious problems facing our nation, and I've been traveling the country urging people to become more involved in civic affairs. It's not enough, I've been saying, to sit on the sidelines ranting at Fox News or cheering Rachel Maddow. But I've been changing my message a little bit lately. I had been urging people to get involved in whatever issues interested them. The idea being that heightened levels of civic participation on all fronts is important. And I still feel that way. But the more I see the human toll that this employment crisis is taking, the more I'm asking people to address that issue specifically. We need to apply big-time pressure on our government officials to develop new and creative strategies that will put Americans back to work not just in the short term, and not just in lousy jobs, but over the course of the next generation and beyond, in ways that allow all of our people to enjoy a reasonable standard of living. Those of us who profess to care about the society that we're creating and will be leaving to future generations need to intervene more directly on this front. We need to redouble our efforts. I'm talking about a really heavy lift here, because there is no magic pill for solving the jobs crisis, or for that matter, any of the other major challenges facing the nation. We need to rebuild the infrastructure. We need to revitalize the public education system. We need to do something about the god-awful influence of big money in politics. And we've got to stop fighting these insane wars. So there's plenty for everybody to do. but I would make jobs the top priority. Barack Obama had the right message in 2008, we need change. But I have given up on the idea that politicians, acting on their own initiative, will bring about the change we need. That kind of change is not going to be initiated by people running for election or re-election with one eye on the polls and the other on their corporate sponsors. That kind of change can only come from the people pressuring politicians provocatively and relentlessly to do the right thing. Our whole history has shown that fundamental change has come from the bottom up, from citizens fed up with unfairness and injustice, from people tired of the status quo. Those movements that shaped who we are, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and so on, they all brought about change by applying sustained pressure that ultimately was too much for the powers that be to resist. We've seen the stirrings of a genuine social movement in the protests against the unconscionable anti-worker laws in Wisconsin and Ohio, and in the protests against the proposed oil pipeline that would run from the Canadian tar sands to the Texas Gulf Coast, and of course in the Occupy protests against the unfairness and economic inequality. But these efforts have been diffuse. They have not come close to realizing their potential. I would like to see a broader movement emerge from these nascent efforts, and I think that movement could coalesce successfully around the need to seriously address the employment crisis. That crisis needs to be addressed not just in fits and starts, but in a sustained and constructive way. If we can't put Americans to work at good jobs over the long term, this society is going to become something that we do not want it to be. And that transformation is already underway. As Columbia's own Joseph Stiglitz pointed out, while the top 1% have seen their incomes rise 18% over the past decade, those in the middle have actually seen their incomes fall. All the growth in recent decades has gone to those at the top. For men with only high school diplomas, incomes have dropped a precipitous 12% over the last quarter of a century. In other words, we're going backwards. And those who think we can maintain a two-tiered society indefinitely, with only those at or near the top doing well, are wrong. That is an unsustainable situation. You need the mass of the people working and paying taxes if you're ever going to get a handle on the budget deficits, and if you're ever going to be able to rebuild the infrastructure as a necessary platform for new industries, and if you're ever going to be able to provide a first-class education for a new generation of well-informed citizens and talented workers. Without ordinary Americans working at good jobs and paying taxes, none of that will happen. Our leaders' refusal to seriously engage these matters is threatening the stability and even the very identity of the United States. Whole communities right now are going down for the count. Take a look at what's happened to Memphis, or the Dorchester section of Boston, or the South Side of Chicago. Detroit and Camden are barely breathing. And as I mentioned, what's happened in some of our Rust Belt and rural communities is really tragic. Joblessness is the root of all this misery. It's an astonishingly destructive force. In his letter from a Birmingham jail back in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King explained the purpose of direct citizen action. It seeks, he said, to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. Ordinary Americans, jobless Americans, underemployed Americans need so to dramatize the employment crisis that it can no longer effectively be ignored. I know it would be difficult to establish the kind of movement that I'm talking about. But if it could get going, and if it did force a serious national conversation about what the world of work should look like in the United States, it would have a good chance of turning the fortunes of this country around and helping many millions of people. It is well worth trying. It could force a reassessment of our trade policies, enhance the ability of workers to organize and negotiate on their own behalf. It could change the disrespectful way so many men and women are treated in the workplace. And it could be the spark that transforms a lot of today's lousy jobs, service jobs that pay little and offer few benefits, into good jobs. The problem with so many of those jobs is not that they are unimportant or that the workers are unskilled. It's that the workers are underpaid. Remember, the industrial jobs that played such a crucial role in building the middle class were once terrible jobs themselves. They paid shameful wages, and the working conditions were often atrocious, even life-threatening. Workers fought back, organizing through unions, marching, striking, sometimes dying. With the help of government policies that guaranteed their right to bargain collectively, they eventually succeeded in raising the wages of those jobs, improving their working conditions, and adding benefits, thus turning those jobs into solid middle-class employment. We need a transformation in our approach to employment in this country, and that can only come from a real movement. Those of us who are doing well, who have benefited from the great bounty of this nation, need to be part of such an effort. We'll benefit as much as anyone, probably more, from an economically stable, broadly prosperous society. So we all have a stake here. But beyond that, we have an absolute obligation to respond to the tremendous pain that this widespread joblessness and underemployment is causing. We have neither the luxury nor the right to be indifferent. Elie Wiesel, in a speech in 1999, addressed the danger of indifference. Indifference can be tempting, he said. More than that, seductive. It is much easier to look away from victims. It is so much easier to avoid such rude interruptions to our work, our dreams, our hopes. Indifference, he said, is not a beginning, it is an end. It is always the friend of the enemy. The suffering that is out there from joblessness in America would break your heart if you could see it close up. Families are splitting up, with children going off to live with grandparents, friends, even strangers. I met a man in Columbus, Ohio, formerly middle class, who lost his job and ended up selling his blood plasma twice a week to put food on the table. In Roswell, I met a man who told me how he, his wife, and his daughters took photos one last time on the porch of their home on the day that it was lost to foreclosure. He had tears in his eyes. That was pretty hard, he said. This story of deep and abiding suffering is not being properly told by the mainstream media. So I've been telling people, as I'm saying here tonight, that we need to raise our voices and sound the alarm about the terrible plight of so many working people in this country. I told the steel workers at their convention in Las Vegas that they needed to do more, that they should join more effectively with their brother and sister unions in rallying those workers who are not yet part of the labor movement, especially the unemployed, who are in such dire need and have so much at stake. I would love to see a silent march of the unemployed, 250,000 strong, converging on Washington. If I were organizing it, I would tell the marchers, don't say anything. Don't speak to the press. Don't chant. Just carry your signs and march silently for an hour or so to the mall in the nation's capital. That would get the people's attention. My friends in the media would go nuts. People tend to forget that the fabled March on Washington in 1963 was a march for jobs and freedom. When Dr. King was killed in Memphis in 1968, he was there in support of black sanitation workers who are striking for higher wages and more dignified treatment. We need to take a cue from that era and those leaders. I've been telling people who think that their own efforts would be too small, too ineffectual to make a difference, that Robert Kennedy said each time some individual stands up for an ideal or strikes out against injustice, that person sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and indifference. On this issue, there is plenty for everyone to do. You can call, write, email, and visit your public officials, urging them to take this jobs crisis more seriously. You can submit op-eds. You can volunteer to help elected officials who are already good on this issue. You can organize meetings of relatives, friends, and associates to brainstorm ideas. You can join civic groups and activist organizations. You can march, do whatever comes to mind. But do something to advance the notion that we need to put America back to work. Get those social networks going. The cynics tell me that there will never be a large-scale, sustained movement on behalf of America's workers and the need to solve the employment crisis. But the cynics never anticipated the success of the labor movement. They never saw the civil rights movement coming. They laughed at the women's movement. That's why I'm not talking to the cynics tonight. I'm talking to you. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks. I think, are we going to do a question and answer? Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think we're going to do a question and answer period unless nobody has a question, in which case I will just go eat.
Actually, we're going to have people lining up over here to ask questions, so you're welcome to stand up.
I'm also ready to answer questions about anything and everything, including whatever happened to my beloved Jets this year, and what I think about the Knicks not being on Time Warner Cable at a time when Jeremy Lin is making everybody nuts. Yes, sir.
I'd like to.
Yeah, if we don't have a mic, that's all right.
My question, I'm taking you up on your offer of subject of question. The theme that you talked about tonight in terms of fairness, justice, two-tiered justice, couldn't that be applied locally to an issue you wrote about so eloquently as a columnist in the New York Times? And I'm talking about the policing tactics of the NYPD under a commissioner who moved away from community policing under Mayor Dinkins, seemingly to the broken windows, quality of life policing under Rudy Giuliani. Don't we have to have a conversation about changing that and perhaps replacing Ray Kelly?
And you need more than a conversation. You need protesters out there in the street. What's going on, I think, is outrageous. I mean, the stories in the paper, I guess, today, they set another record on stop and frisk. You know, crime keeps coming down, 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 and people are being stopped, frisked, and humiliated in the streets in ever greater numbers. I wrote that, you know, if we get crime down to zero, maybe that will be the excuse to search everybody in the city. I mean, it's an absurdity to me. But beyond that, there's just all kinds of harassment going on. There's a proposal, I guess, to start busting people for eating in the subway. So if you have a kid that's late for school and is hustling off and has a muffin and is in the subway station or on the train, that kid can get written up. They're writing up people for taking up more than one seat in an empty subway car. So I don't know what happened to Ray Kelly. I really liked Ray and thought he did a heck of a job when he was in the Dinkins administration. I thought it was a terrific choice to bring him back as police commissioner. But just like the United States, Ray Kelly has lost his way. Yes.
Sure. Hi, my name is Arthur Peng. I'm a student here at SIPA. First of all, Mr. Herbert, thank you for coming to speak with us today. My question to you is about, you mentioned the president's need to look more at jobs. And with the 2010 passage of the health care reform bill, a lot of Republicans and a lot of people were saying, well, the president should have focused more on jobs at the beginning of his administration, not necessarily on health care. And you mentioned insofar as jobs as being a component of consumption, of this 70% consumption that we have, far less of our current GDP is in government transfers, things like health care. So I wanted to ask you about, did the president over-prioritize things other than jobs during his during the things that he's currently pushed for? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I was, among my liberal colleagues, friends, and associates, I was in the minority in the sense that I did not think that the president should have gone for health care when he did. I would have liked to have seen that come later in his administration, even though health care reform is a really important issue. I thought that it was incredibly important then to focus on jobs, to do something big, meaningful on jobs. And I thought that it was important to seize the moment. When he became president, we were losing, I guess, about 600,000 or 700,000 jobs a month, when people were worried that we were going to be plunged back into another depression. And that was the moment that needed to be seized. That was a time when we could have demanded that trade agreements be renegotiated, that we could have made a huge investment in rebuilding infrastructure. I mean, we've got all these factory workers, manufacturing workers who have lost their jobs in the downturn. We've got all these construction workers who were thrown out of work. Those are the kinds of people that you could just put to work right away on infrastructure. And I even thought that they made a mistake when they were talking about shovel-ready jobs, that what we need is a strategy for putting Americans back to work for the long term, not just the short term. So start building up those jobs for the long term, infrastructure for the long term, establish an infrastructure bank. So yeah, I think that the priorities were a little bit out of whack early in the administration. I would have much preferred much more of a focus on employment. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Thanks. My name is Rafael. I'm a student here. You started alluding to this question already, and it has to do with the second part of the equation, and that is, where are those jobs going to come from? You mentioned infrastructure, but as you mentioned, that can be very short term. So what are some of your ideas about how is the economy going to be able to absorb all these new jobs that we're going to have?
I'm not under any illusion that there is anything easy about fixing America's job crisis. Maybe the thing that upsets me most is that it's not taken seriously enough, that we don't have enough people focusing intently on what to do about it. Some things, some ideas that are tossed around out there make a lot of sense. Infrastructure is absolutely important. One, because we need to do it. In my book, I opened the book with the story of a woman who was on that I-35 bridge that collapsed in Minneapolis into the Mississippi River, and I tell her whole story. She was really badly hurt. So we need to rebuild infrastructure at the same time that we need the jobs that rebuilding the infrastructure would provide. And it is at a time when interest rates are historically low. So, you could finance this at lower amounts than historically you ordinarily would be able to. I also think that we should have made a much bigger push on the whole green energy issue. I mean, we've had enormous scientific breakthroughs in the United States, and then we really just haven't followed through on it, especially in the manufacturing elements that have been applied. So we've created green energy initiatives and then shipped the manufacturing aspects of those initiatives off to other countries, to Germany, to Asia, and that sort of thing. I think that because there is so much suffering related to unemployment and underemployment, that we need a 21st century WPA type program where the government is the employer of last resort, not as a permanent thing, but as an interim measure until we can get the economy back to a self-sustaining situation where enough jobs are created. But the other thing is that when you do infrastructure, when you do green energy, when you emphasize R&D, when you invest in your education system, suddenly you start to get some happy surprises. Breakthroughs are made that lead to new industries. You begin to find ways in which you can move away from coal and oil and that sort of thing in ways that are affordable, so that maybe you find that solar energy or hydrogen energy or that sort of thing, maybe you find a mechanism by which that becomes more affordable, and then that kind of industry takes off. You don't really know what happens. I remember that when the country was paranoid about the Soviets after Sputnik back in the 1950s, and then we went bananas on the space race. But look at the advances that resulted from the space race. I mean, who knew that sort of thing was going to happen? In the very beginning, we couldn't even get our rockets to stay up in the air. They would be on television, they'd go up and they'd blow up on television. Everybody would be embarrassed. But eventually it turned into a wonderful thing. So, I think that we should be charging full speed ahead on all those fronts. But I also think we should have the smartest people in our society getting together. And by the way, including people on so many of the wonderful college campuses that we have in this country, getting together and trying to come up with creative ideas about what we might be able to do about employment. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask very much what he asked about what your vision would be. You sort of hinted at it. Let me be specific about what you see as the role of unions.
Good question. The role of unions right now, I think, and I think that there are some pretty good union leaders around, the role of unions is to fight harder. One of the things that I don't see in the society now that I saw when I was growing up and when I was a young man is a sense of militancy, not violence, but militancy, where people would actually fight hard for the things they believed in. Democratic Party was like that. Labor unions used to be like that. The women's movement was like that. I think the labor movement, like so many other elements in our society, has become much too timid. I want the labor movement out there fighting on its own behalf, fighting on behalf of America's workers, fighting to get the NLRB to be more effective, fighting to sign up more workers, fighting on behalf of political candidates, fighting more on behalf of political candidates that uphold the things that labor believes in. I think that labor spends much too much time picking and choosing among candidates and then throwing money at them, whether they win, lose, or whatever. Whereas I think labor should be focused less on the politicians and more on the workers they represent and that they hope to represent. And I think labor, there's two things. I think the Democratic Party ought to be registering everybody that moves, because the more people you register, the majority of them are going to be Democrats. So sign up all these voters. You should go nuts on that. And on labor, I think that they should be trying to bring people into unions, everybody that they can just find. Go into those areas that are traditionally hostile to labor and say, you know what, I don't care if the people around here are hostile. You there, let me tell you what labor can do for you. Sign on the dotted line, if you will. I want more militancy in this society. I think I'm being given the hook. I feel like I'm at the Apollo. Thank you very much.
So thanks to Bob Herbert for an inspiring speech. The Weston Lecture has never been given with more conviction and effectiveness. Thank you very much, Bob. I want to invite all of you to a reception in honor of Bob Herbert. It's right outside in the great space near the elevators. And thank you all for coming. Goodbye.